In 364 CE, the Council of Laodicea removed a book from approved Christian scripture and declared it forbidden. 17 centuries later, in a cave above the Dead Sea, archaeologists pulled 11 copies of that book out of the rock, more copies than most books still in your Bible today. The book was the Book of Enoch, and what that book contains, in its oldest and most suppressed passages, is a systematic account of human beings who existed before Adam, not after. Before. The Book of Enoch describes a race of people that predated the creation account in Genesis, gives them physical characteristics, describes their relationship to the divine beings who descended to earth, and explains what happened to them. Western Christianity has known about these passages since at least 1906, when R.H. Charles published the first major English translation. The Church has never addressed them publicly. This script covers the specific passages, the scholars who identified them, and what the text actually says about who came before the humans in Genesis. If suppressed biblical history is what brings you back, hit subscribe. Every week we uncover what was pulled from Scripture. The passages that describe pre-Adamic humans are found primarily in two sections of the Book of Enoch. The first is the Book of the Watchers, chapters 1 through 36, and specifically chapters 6 through 9, where the Watchers descend and interact with what the text calls the daughters of men. The second is the Animal Apocalypse, which is chapters 85 through 90 of the Dream Visions section. The Aramaic fragments that preserve the Watchers section are designated 4Q201 and 4Q202, discovered in Cave 4 at Qumran in 1952 and currently held at the Israel Antiquities Authority in Jerusalem. They date to roughly 100 BCE, placing them over a century older than the New Testament. The Ethiopian Ge'ez version, the fullest surviving text, is preserved at Aksum and was translated into English by Ephraim Isaac in 1983 for the Old Testament Pseudepigrapha volumes. Scholar George Nicholsburg of the University of Iowa, whose 2001 Hermenia commentary on Enoch remains the authoritative English language treatment, spent extended pages on the pre-Adamic implications of chapters 6 through 9. He noted that the text describes the Watchers descending to a population that is already fully established on Earth, that the daughters of men are not newly created beings, but members of an organized human population with social structure, with beauty standards, with enough cultural complexity to attract the attention of celestial beings who found them desirable. That is not a description of recently formed humans, that is a description of civilization. Scholar Joseph Milik, who worked on the Qumran Aramaic fragments at the École Biblique in Jerusalem for decades, identified the Daughters of Men passage in 4Q201 as one of the most linguistically precise sections in the entire Aramaic Enoch corpus. The language used for the existing population is consistently past continuous in tense, describing an ongoing state, not a recent beginning. And here is what makes this different from every broad summary of Enoch you have encountered. This is not a reinterpretation. This is not reading something into the text that is not there. The Book of Enoch, chapter 6, verse 1, in the Ge'ez text translated by Ephraim Isaac, says this: "In those days, when the children of men had multiplied, it happened that there were born unto them beautiful and comely daughters." The phrase "in those days" is a temporal marker. It places the Watchers' descent at a specific time, a time that the Enoch narrative treats as distinct from the creation events of Genesis. The daughters of men are not described as new, they are described as having multiplied. They have been present long enough to produce generations. They are already numerous, and the word translated as multiplied in both the Ge'ez and the partial Aramaic fragments at Qumran is the same word used elsewhere in Genesis to describe population growth over extended time. This is not the description of a first generation. This is a description of a people with history behind them. Scholar Emil Pioch of the École Biblique in Jerusalem, who worked on the Qumran Aramaic fragments for decades, published an analysis in 1997 noting that the Aramaic grammar of the Daughters of Men passage is identical in structure to other ancient Near Eastern texts describing established populations, not newly created ones. The grammatical pattern is the same pattern used in Akkadian texts, which are Babylonian texts from ancient Iraq, to describe people who have been present for generations. It is not the grammar of origins, it is the grammar of continuation. Pioch noted this without drawing the pre-Adamic conclusion explicitly. He simply noted the grammatical fact and moved on. The conclusion the grammar supports, he left unstated. Scholar Lorenz Stuckenbrook of Ludwig Maximilian University of Munich, in his 2007 analysis of the Book of the Watchers, made an additional observation about the tense pattern Puke identified. He noted that the past continuous grammar is not accidental, it is the specific grammatical form used in ancient literature to describe background conditions, the state of the world as it already existed before the main narrative events began. It is the grammar of what was already true before the story started. The Daughters of Men passage uses that grammar throughout. The text begins with this. In the Animal Apocalypse, chapters 85 through 90, Enoch is given a vision in which the entire history of humanity is shown to him in symbolic form, with human beings represented as animals. The first humans in the vision are depicted as white bulls. Adam and Eve appear in the vision as a white bull and a white cow, and their descendants continue as white cattle for several generations. But here is what most summaries miss entirely. Before the white bull appears in the vision, before what the text identifies as Adam, there are other figures already present in the symbolic landscape. Scholar John Collins of Yale Divinity School, in his 2010 volume The Scepter and the Star, noted that the chronological structure of the animal apocalypse is more complex than it first appears, and that the pre-Adamic figures in the early verses of chapter 85 have been consistently underrid by Western commentators. The vision does not begin with Adam. It begins with something that was already there when Adam arrived. Scholar Margaret Barker of the British Academy, in her 2004 book Temple Theology, traced the white bull symbolism to specific pre-exilic temple ritual traditions, meaning traditions that existed in the Jerusalem temple before the Babylonian exile in 586 BCE. Those traditions, Barker argued, encoded an institutional memory of human existence before the Genesis creation account as the Western tradition understands it. But the text doesn't stop there. The second element of the pre-Adamic account is found in chapters 6 and 7, in the passage describing what the Watchers found when they descended. The text says they saw the daughters of men, that they were beautiful, and that they chose wives from among them. The word translated as chose implies selection from a larger pool. There are more women than the ones selected. There is a population. Scholar Michael Knibb of King's College London, who produced the definitive critical edition of the Ge'ez text for Oxford University Press in 1978, noted in his commentary that the syntax of the selection passage implies an established human society, not individuals recently brought into existence, but members of a group large enough that choosing from among them was a meaningful act. The Watchers are not encountering a small family. They are encountering a civilization old enough to have developed what the text calls beauty, a concept that requires cultural history, requires comparison, requires an established standard against which individuals are measured. You cannot have a concept of beautiful daughters in a population that has existed for only one generation. That concept requires accumulated time. What the translators left out is this. Chapter 7 continues with what happened after the Watchers took wives, and it contains a detail that bears directly on the pre-Adamic question. The text describes the offspring of the Watchers and the daughters of men, the Nephilim, as consuming the resources of the existing human population. They are described as eating what the humans produced. They are consuming the labor of people who were already there, already farming, already building, already producing surplus that could be consumed. A society that produces surplus is not newly created, it is established. It has gone through the stages of subsistence and moved into organized production. That kind of economic organization requires not decades but centuries, possibly millennia, to develop. The Enoch text describes it as already in place when the Nephilim appear. Think of it like arriving at a city that has a functioning market, established roads, and organized trade, and being told the city was founded last Tuesday. The economics do not allow for it. Scholar Torleif Elgvin of the Norwegian School of Theology, working on Qumran texts at the Schoyen Collection in Oslo, noted in a 2003 paper that the agricultural and productive terminology used in Chapter 7 of the Aramaic fragments corresponds to descriptions of mature sedentary civilization, not newly formed human communities. The part that should not be possible is this. The Ge'ez text at Aksum, in the section of Chapter 7 preserved only in the Ethiopian tradition, contains an additional phrase not found in any published Aramaic or Greek version. Scholar Ephraim Isaac noted in a 1983 editorial footnote that this phrase appears to describe the pre-existing human population as having what translates in Ge'ez as accumulated knowledge, a term that appears elsewhere in the Ge'ez tradition to describe skills passed down through generations of teaching, not skills acquired individually. Accumulated knowledge across generations requires time. It requires teachers who learn from teachers. The phrase implies a civilization old enough to have developed and transmitted specialized knowledge across multiple human lifetimes before the events of chapter 6 occur. Here is what makes this stranger still. In 2021, a team of geneticists at the Max Planck Institute for Evolutionary Anthropology in Leipzig published findings on what they called ghost populations, ancient human groups that interbred with both modern humans and Neanderthals but left no known fossil record. The research was led by Priya Morjani, a population geneticist at the University of California, Berkeley. The study, published in the journal Science Advances, identified genetic signatures in modern human populations that could only be explained by admixture with a deeply archaic human group, a group that diverged from the main human lineage over 1 million years ago and whose physical remains have never been found. The study did not reference Enoch. There is no reason it would have. But what it described, an organized, deeply ancient human population that interacted with more recently arrived groups and left genetic traces without leaving physical ones, is structurally parallel to what Enoch chapter 6 describes, a population already present, already established, already interacting with beings descending from outside the known order. Enoch called them the daughters of men. The geneticists called them a ghost population. Both are describing something that was there before the story we thought we knew had begun. Scholar James Van der Kam of the University of Notre Dame, in his 2012 book The Dead Sea Scrolls Today, addressed the daughters of men problem directly and noted that the Enoch tradition represents the oldest surviving Jewish interpretation of Genesis 6, predating by at least 2 centuries the rabbinic tradition that later developed the sons of Seth reading that Jerome adopted. Van der Kam noted that the Enoch tradition had no need to explain away a pre-Adamic population because the Enoch tradition did not begin from the assumption that Adam was the first human. The assumption of a singular first human is a later theological imposition, not an original reading of the Genesis text. The Enoch tradition preceded that imposition and was suppressed in part because it did. And this is where it gets disturbing. The suppression of the pre-Adamic implications in Enoch follows a documentable path. The Council of Laodicea in 364 CE removed Enoch from approved texts. That is the foundational act. But the specific suppression of the pre-Adamic reading has a more targeted history. Jerome, who produced the official Latin Bible around 400 CE, encountered the Daughters of Men passage when working on Genesis 6 and chose to harmonize it with the Adamic narrative by translating the Hebrew phrase sons of God as sons of Seth, an interpretation that has no textual basis but that removes the pre-Adamic implication entirely. If the sons of God are simply the male descendants of Seth, then the daughters of men are simply the female descendants of Cain, and the entire encounter becomes an interfamily story with no cosmological implications. Jerome's translation choice made the pre-Adamic reading invisible to anyone reading only the Latin Bible. Augustine in City of God endorsed Jerome's reading and ruled that any interpretation suggesting humans existed before Adam was incompatible with Christian doctrine. R.H. Charles, in his 1906 English translation of Enoch, restored the Watcher's reading but surrounded the pre-Adamic implications with so many qualifications that most readers absorbed the text without registering what was being said. Florentino Garcia Martinez, in his 1994 critical edition of the Dead Sea Scrolls texts, noted that the pre-Adamic question raised by the Enoch Watcher's passage had received almost no serious scholarly attention since Charles, not because it had been answered, but because it had been consistently set aside. In 2018, a research team from the University of Birmingham submitted a formal application to the Ethiopian church authorities in Aksum to study the Ge'ez manuscripts of chapters 85 through 90 of the Animal Apocalypse, the sections with the most explicit pre-Adamic content. The application was denied. Scholar Lawrence Stuckenbrook, who was associated with the research team, noted in a published summary that the Aksum archive appears to contain Ge'ez manuscript materials, that differ from currently published editions in the chapters most directly relevant to the pre-Adamic question. He submitted a research inquiry asking specifically about access to those chapters. He received a response indicating the materials were under ecclesiastical review. That review has not concluded. Scholar John Collins of Yale Divinity School, who reviewed the Birmingham application outcome in a 2019 conference paper, noted that the sections of the Aksum archive most relevant to the pre-Adamic question are described in 19th century European traveler accounts as containing substantial marginal annotations in a second hand, meaning a later copyist added commentary to the margins. Those annotations have not been photographed. They have not been described in any published catalog. Their content is unknown outside the archive. In 2022, a researcher associated with the Schoyen collection in Oslo noted in a conference paper that a small group of vellum fragments in the collection appear to contain text from the early animal apocalypse chapters, including passages with no published parallel. The fragments have not been fully translated. Now, let me be clear, I am not saying the Book of Enoch proves the existence of a separate pre-Adamic human race that genetic science has now confirmed. The text is ancient. It operates in a cosmological framework that requires careful handling. What is not debatable is this. The Enoch text describes human beings who were already present on Earth in organized, productive society when the events of chapters 6 and 7 occur, events that the Genesis narrative places before the flood well within the Adamic timeline. The internal logic of the Enoch text requires a population that predates the Genesis creation account as most Western Christians understand it. That requirement has been present in the manuscripts since before the New Testament was written. The question of who the daughters of men were has generated more quiet discomfort in the academic study of Genesis than almost any other textual problem. Scholars who work directly on the Genesis 6 passage know the Enoch tradition. They know what the Aramaic fragments say about the population that was already there. And the most common response, in academic publications, in seminary classrooms, in biblical commentary, is to route the reader past the problem as quickly as possible. State the watcher's reading, note its antiquity, and move on to the theological implications of the flood. The pre-Adamic implication is present in the text. It is noted. It is not pursued. The silence around it is not the silence of ignorance. It is the silence of an academic discipline that has learned which questions it is not allowed to treat as significant. The Aramaic fragments 4Q201 and 4Q202 are still in Jerusalem. The Ethiopian manuscripts in Aksum contain the full text of chapters 6 through 9 and 85 through 90. Scholar Margaret Barker of the British Academy argued in her 2004 book Temple Theology that the pre-Adamic traditions in Enoch were not fringe material but central to the pre-exilic theology of the Jerusalem temple, a theology systematically dismantled when Enoch was suppressed. She traced the white bull symbolism of the animal apocalypse to specific temple ritual traditions that encoded a memory of human existence before the Adamic creation account. She did not treat this as mythology. She traced it as institutional memory, a record of what had been believed, preserved in symbolic form, read aloud to people who understood what it meant. The daughters of men are still described in the text as they always were, numerous, established, beautiful, chosen from among a population that had been there long enough to produce generation after generation of human beings with a history behind them. Jerome buried that description in 400 CE. The manuscripts in Aksum are still reading it. The daughters of men are still there, still numerous, still already present when the divine beings arrived. The text has not changed. The question has not been answered.